You know that moment when you realize your entire life has become a lie? When the people you birthed, raised, and sacrificed everything for look you straight in the eye and tell you you're worthless? I'm 78 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. My name is Meredith Caldwell, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the cruelest prisons are built by the hands of those we love most. But more importantly, this is the story of how I found the key to my own freedom, hidden in the very place they never thought to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filters through the thin curtains of what used to be my grandson's bedroom, casting long shadows across the cramped space that has become my world. The single bed creaks beneath me as I shift, my arthritic joints protesting against another night on a mattress that's seen better decades. The walls are still decorated with faded superhero posters, a cruel reminder that this room was never meant for someone like me. Someone old. Someone forgotten. I can hear them downstairs already. My son David and my daughter Susan. Their voices, carrying that particular tone they reserve for discussions about me. Not with me, mind you. About me. As if I'm some sort of inconvenient furniture that needs to be moved or disposed of. I strain to listen, though I know I shouldn't. Nothing good ever comes from eavesdropping on conversations about yourself, especially when you're the subject everyone wishes would simply disappear. She's getting worse. Susan's voice drifts up through the thin floor. My daughter, the one I used to braid ribbons into her hair every morning before school. The one who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms, trusting me to keep all the scary things away. Now her voice carries nothing but irritation when she speaks of me. The doctor said it's normal aging, David responds, his tone dismissive. My son, my firstborn, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them the most beautiful flowers in the world. The one who became a successful lawyer because I worked 3 jobs to put him through college. We just have to deal with it. Deal with it. Deal with me. That's what I've become in their eyes, a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. I pull my worn robe tighter around my shoulders and reach for my walking cane, the one with the carved handle that my late husband Harold gave me for my 70th birthday. It was supposed to be a joke then, something we laughed about together. For when you're really old and need help getting around, he had said with that mischievous grin of his. Neither of us imagined that 8 years later, it would become both my lifeline and my torment. The stairs creak under my careful descent, each step a small negotiation between my will and my aging body. I've learned to time these morning journeys perfectly, arriving in the kitchen just as David finishes his coffee and Susan packs the last of the children's lunches. It's a delicate dance, inserting myself into their routine without causing too much disruption, without reminding them too obviously of my presence in their carefully ordered lives. Good morning, I offer quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I've learned to make myself small, unobtrusive. Mice make less noise than I do these days, and they get treated with more consideration. David doesn't look up from his phone, scrolling through what I assume are important lawyer things that are far more pressing than acknowledging his mother. Susan glances at me with the kind of look you might give a stray cat that's wandered into your kitchen, a mixture of annoyance and resignation. There's cereal in the cabinet, Susan says without warmth, not bothering to pause in her lunch packing routine. The cheap stuff. We're trying to cut expenses. The cheap stuff. I nod and shuffle toward the cabinet, though we both know the cheap cereal isn't about cutting expenses. It's about reminding me of my place in this household, about making sure I understand that I'm here on their charity, their sufferance. Every small indignity is carefully calculated, designed to erode whatever dignity I might still possess. I pour the generic cornflakes into a chipped bowl, add milk that's a day past its expiration, and sit at the far end of the kitchen table where I won't be in anyone's way. The cereal tastes like cardboard, but I eat it anyway because refusing would only give them another reason to lecture me about being difficult, ungrateful, a burden they can barely manage to bear. Mom's appointment is at 2, David says to Susan, still not acknowledging that I'm sitting right here, that I'm perfectly capable of remembering my own medical appointments. Can you take her, or do I need to reschedule my deposition? I have parent-teacher conferences all afternoon, Susan replies with an exaggerated sigh. Can't she take a taxi or something? They're talking about me as if I'm not here, as if I'm some sort of complicated logistics problem rather than a human being who raised them both, who changed their diapers and sat up with them through countless sick nights and celebrated every small triumph of their childhood. I want to speak up, to remind them that I'm sitting right here, that I have ears and feelings and a voice of my own. But I've learned that speaking up only makes things worse. Fine, David snaps, finally looking at me with undisguised irritation. But you need to be ready at 1:30 sharp. I'm not waiting around if you're not ready. I nod obediently, keeping my eyes fixed on my cereal bowl. 1:30 sharp. As if I have anywhere else to be, anything else to do with my time. As if my entire existence doesn't revolve around their schedules, their convenience, their barely concealed resentment at having to care for the woman who gave them life. The sound of children's footsteps thunders down the stairs, my grandchildren racing through the kitchen like small tornadoes. Emma, 12, with her mother's sharp features and dismissive attitude. Michael, 10, who still sometimes looks at me with something approaching curiosity before remembering that I'm not worth his attention. They grab their lunches and backpacks without so much as glancing in my direction, as if I'm part of the furniture, as invisible as the kitchen table or the refrigerator. Bye, Mom, they call to Susan, completely ignoring my presence. I remember when they were babies, how they used to reach for me with chubby fingers, how Emma used to insist I read her bedtime, stories in funny voices, how Michael used to bring me his scraped knees for grandmotherly kisses and Band-Aids. Now they look through me as if I don't exist, trained by their parents to see me as irrelevant, as background noise in their busy lives. The house empties quickly after that, leaving me alone with the echoing silence and the weight of my own irrelevance. This is my life now, these long stretches of solitude punctuated by moments of casual cruelty, days that blend together in an endless stream of small humiliations and quiet desperation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wash my cereal bowl carefully, dry it with the dish rag that's seen better days, and put it away in its designated spot. Even this simple act feels fraught with potential consequences. Put it in the wrong place, and Susan will lecture me about disrupting her system. Leave water spots, and David will make some cutting comment about how I can't even clean a bowl properly anymore. The living room beckons with its worn furniture and outdated television, but I know better than to make myself too comfortable there. That's their space, not mine. I'm allowed to occupy it when they're not around, but I must always be ready to vacate the moment they return, to retreat to my small room upstairs where I can be forgotten again. Instead, I find myself drawn to the window that overlooks the street, watching as neighbors go about their daily lives. Mrs. Patterson from next door waves as she tends to her garden, and I wave back tentatively, knowing that any interaction with the outside world will be reported and analyzed later. Mom was bothering the neighbors again, Susan will say, or she's getting too friendly with people who don't understand the situation. The situation, that's what they call it, as if my presence in their lives is some sort of temporary crisis that will eventually resolve itself. And perhaps it will, in the way that all situations involving elderly parents eventually resolve themselves. But until then, I'm here, occupying space they resent giving, consuming resources they begrudge providing, existing in a state of constant apology for the crime of growing old. The hours pass slowly, marked by the ticking of the mantel clock that Harold and I bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Vermont. It seems like another lifetime now, when we were young and strong and thought we had forever ahead of us. When we believed that the children we were raising would care for us in our old age the way we had cared for our own parents, with love and respect and genuine concern for our well-being. How naive we were, thinking that love was unconditional, that the bonds between parent and child were unbreakable. How foolish to believe that sacrifice and devotion would be remembered and returned when we needed it most. The truth is far uglier, far more practical. Children grow up and build their own lives, and sometimes there's no room in those lives for the people who made them possible. At 1 o'clock, I begin preparing for my appointment, though there isn't much to prepare. I change from my worn house, dress into my slightly less worn going-out dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that Susan says makes me look like an old lady. I am an old lady, I want to tell her. But I've learned that stating obvious truths only invites more criticism. I brush my thin hair as best I can, trying to tame the cowlicks that seem to multiply with each passing year. My reflection in the bathroom mirror shows a stranger, someone hollow-eyed and diminished, someone who looks like she's apologizing for her own existence. When did I become this person? When did I lose myself so completely that I can barely recognize the woman staring back at me? David appears at exactly 1:30, car keys in hand and impatience written across his face. He doesn't ask how I'm feeling or if I'm ready. He doesn't offer his arm to help me down the front steps or wait while I settle myself in the passenger seat. He simply expects me to keep up, to manage my own difficulties without inconveniencing him any more than absolutely necessary. The drive to the doctor's office passes in silence, broken only by David's occasional sighs and the sound of his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. I want to ask him about his work, about his children, about anything that might bridge the chasm that has opened between us. But I know that any attempt at conversation will be met with monosyllabic responses and barely concealed irritation. Dr. Martinez has been my physician for 15 years, since before Harold died, and she's one of the few people who still treats me like a human being worthy of respect and consideration. Her waiting room is warm and welcoming, filled with patients of all ages who nod politely when I enter. Here, at least, I'm not invisible. Mrs. Caldwell. The receptionist calls after what feels like hours but is probably only minutes. The doctor will see you now. I rise carefully, using my cane for support, and make my way to the examination room. Behind me, I can hear David's phone buzzing with what he considers important messages from important people living important lives. I'm not important anymore, haven't been for years, but I still remember what it felt like when I was. Dr. Martinez enters with her usual warm smile, the kind that reaches her eyes and makes me feel like a person rather than a problem. She's younger than my children, probably in her early 40s, but she possesses a kindness that seems to have skipped my offspring entirely. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. Caldwell?" she asks, settling into her chair and giving me her full attention. It's such a simple question, but it's been months since anyone asked it and genuinely wanted to hear the answer. "I'm managing," I say, because that's what I always say. It's the safe answer, the one that doesn't invite too many follow-up questions or concerned looks. But Dr. Martinez has known me long enough to read between the lines. "And how are things at home?" she asks gently, her pen poised over my chart, but her eyes focused on my face. "Are you getting the support you need?" Support. What an interesting word for what I receive at home. I get shelter and food, the bare minimum required to keep me alive and functional. But support implies something more, something warmer and more nurturing than the cold charity I'm offered. "My children are very busy," I say carefully, aware that David is probably listening from the waiting room, that anything I say here might find its way back to him and Susan. "They have their own lives to manage." Dr. Martinez nods, but I can see the concern in her eyes. She's treated enough elderly patients to recognize the signs, the careful language and nervous glances that indicate all is not well at home. But she also knows that there's only so much she can do if I'm not willing to be honest about my situation. The examination is routine, checking my blood pressure and heart rate, examining my joints for signs of arthritis progression, asking about my medications and any new symptoms. Everything is normal for a woman my age, she assures me, though normal at 78 includes aches and pains and limitations that would have seemed impossible when I was younger. Your balance seems to be improving, she notes, watching as I walk across the room. Are you doing the exercises I recommended? I nod, though the truth is more complicated. I do the exercises when I can, when David and Susan aren't around to make comments about my movements or question why I'm taking up space in their living room. It's another small indignity, having to hide my attempts at maintaining my health and independence. Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Martinez says as she finishes updating my chart, I want you to know that there are resources available if you ever need help. Social services, community programs, support groups for seniors. Sometimes it helps to talk to people who understand what you're going through. Her words hang in the air between us, heavy with implication and possibility. Resources, help, support, groups. These sound like lifelines thrown to a drowning woman, but I know better than to grasp for them too eagerly. David and Susan monitor my activities carefully, and any attempt to reach out for help would be seen as betrayal, as an admission that they're not providing adequate care. Thank you, I say quietly, tucking the information away like a secret. I'll keep that in mind. The drive home is even quieter than the drive to the office, if such a thing is possible. David seems lost in his own thoughts, probably planning legal strategies or calculating billable hours. I stare out the passenger window at the familiar neighborhoods we pass, remembering when I used to drive these streets myself, when I had places to go and people to see and a life that belonged to me. My car had been the first thing to go after Harold died. It's not safe, David had declared, producing statistics about elderly drivers and accident rates, as if my 80-year-old driving record wasn't evidence enough of my competence. We'll drive you wherever you need to go. Except they don't drive me wherever I need to go. They drive me where they think I should go, when it's convenient for them, always with the air of people doing me an enormous favor that I should be grateful for. My independence had been stripped away one small piece at a time, so gradually that I barely noticed until it was gone completely. Back at the house, David disappears immediately into his home office, probably to make up for the time he lost, taking me to my appointment. I retreat to my room upstairs, settling into the single chair by the window with a book I've read so many times the pages are soft with handling. Reading is still allowed, as long as I don't leave books lying around, in common areas or ask anyone to drive me to the library. The afternoon passes slowly, punctuated by the sounds of family life happening around me and without me. Susan returns from her parent-teacher conferences, her voice sharp as she calls to David about dinner plans and homework supervision and all the complicated logistics of modern family life. The children arrive home from school with their backpacks, and energy and complete indifference to my presence in their house. Dinner time is always the most challenging part of the day, the hour when my invisibility becomes most apparent. I sit at my designated spot at the kitchen table, eating whatever has been prepared without comment or complaint, listening to conversations about soccer practice and school projects and weekend plans that don't include me. Occasionally, someone will direct a practical question in my direction about my medications or upcoming appointments, but these aren't conversations. They're administrative inquiries, the kind you might make to a household staff member whose schedule needs to be coordinated. Mom needs to see the eye doctor next month, Susan announces to David over their chicken casserole, speaking about me as if I'm not sitting 3 feet away. Her prescription is probably outdated. Can't it wait until after my trial? David responds, cutting his meat with unnecessary force. I don't have time for non-essential appointments right now. Non-essential, My ability to see clearly is non-essential, something that can be postponed indefinitely for the convenience of others. I want to point out that I could take a taxi or ask a neighbor for help, that there are solutions that don't require their precious time and attention. But suggesting alternatives only irritates them more, implies that I'm trying to be independent when dependence is what's expected of me. After dinner, I help clear the dishes, moving carefully around the kitchen while Susan loads the dishwasher with efficient mechanical movements. She doesn't thank me for helping, doesn't acknowledge my presence at all unless I'm in her way. Then she'll give an exaggerated sigh and suggest that maybe I should go upstairs and rest, that I've done enough for one day. Enough. As if my small attempts to contribute to the household are burdensome rather than helpful, as if I'm somehow overextending myself by carrying a few plates to the counter. I'm not allowed to be useful, but I'm also criticized for being useless. It's a delicate balance that I can never quite achieve. The evening stretches ahead like an endless corridor, hours to fill with nothing but my own thoughts and the distant sounds of a family that has moved on without me. Sometimes I can hear David and Susan talking in their bedroom, their voices low but their frustration clear. They're talking about me again, discussing options and making decisions that will affect my life without any input from me. I've become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved, and the solution they're moving toward becomes clearer with each passing day. The brochures started appearing a few months ago, glossy pamphlets featuring smiling elderly people in clean, institutional settings, assisted living communities, they call them now, as if giving them cheerful names changes what they really are. But tonight, as I prepare for bed in my narrow single bed, surrounded by superhero posters, something feels different. Maybe it's the conversation with Dr. Martinez, or maybe it's simply the accumulation of too many small indignities and casual cruelties. Something is shifting inside me, some long dormant part of my spirit that remembers what it felt like to be valued, to be respected, to matter. I think about Harold, about the life we built together, and the plans we made for our golden years. We were going to travel, to spend time with our grandchildren, to enjoy the fruits of decades of hard work and sacrifice. We never imagined that those golden years would be tarnished by neglect and resentment, that the children we raised would see us as obstacles rather than treasures. Harold had been a good man, a careful man who worried about providing for his family long after he was gone. "I want to make sure you're taken care of," he used to say during his final illness, and I had assured him that the children would look after me, that I would be fine. How wrong we both were about what being taken care of would actually look like. As I drift toward sleep, I find myself remembering Harold's final weeks, the conversations we had about money and security, and making sure I would have everything I needed. He had been so concerned about the details, so insistent that I understand our financial situation completely. At the time, I had been more focused on his health, on spending every possible moment with him before he was gone. The practical matters seemed secondary to the overwhelming reality of losing the love of my life. But now, lying in this narrow bed in this room that isn't really mine, I wonder if there were things Harold tried to tell me that I wasn't ready to hear. Important things about our finances, about protections he had put in place, about resources I might have forgotten in the fog of grief and adjustment that followed his death. Tomorrow I'll be 78 years and one day old, another day deeper, into a life that feels less like living and more like existing. But tonight, for the first time in months, I fall asleep wondering if there might be another way forward, if the story of Meredith Caldwell might not be over after all. Sometimes the most important chapters are the ones that come when you think the book is already finished, when you believe there's nothing left to write. I close my eyes and dream of Harold, of the gentle way he used to take my hand and promise that everything would be all right. In my dream, he's trying to tell me something important, something I need to remember. But the words fade as sleep takes hold, leaving only the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, there's still a light waiting to be found. The sound that wakes me isn't my usual alarm, or the creaking of old bones against a mattress that offers no comfort. It's the unmistakable crash of something breaking, followed by David's voice thundering through the thin walls with a fury I haven't heard since he was a teenager, throwing tantrums about curfews and consequences. I lie still for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The digital clock beside my bed glows an accusatory red in the darkness, informing me that it's 3:47 in the morning. Whatever has happened downstairs, it's significant enough to wake the entire household, though I notice with growing dread that no other voices join David's increasingly violent outburst. The floorboards above my head creak as Susan's footsteps move quickly across their bedroom, and I can hear her urgent whispers even through the ceiling. There's fear in her voice, the kind of sharp anxiety that comes when carefully constructed. Facades begin to crumble. I've heard that tone before, usually when David's drinking gets out of hand or when his temper finally exceeds his ability to maintain his professional composure. Against my better judgment, I push myself upright and reach for my robe, the threadbare terry cloth that's become my armor against the world. My cane feels heavier than usual as I grip its familiar handle, the carved wood smooth from years of Harold's touch and now my own desperate clutching. Every instinct tells me to stay in my room, to pull the covers over my head and pretend that whatever crisis is unfolding downstairs has nothing to do with me. But I can't. Despite everything they've done to me, despite the daily humiliations and casual cruelties, these are still my children. The babies I held through countless sleepless nights. The toddlers whose scraped knees I kissed. The teenagers whose hearts I helped mend when first loves turned to first heartbreaks. The invisible threads that bind us may be frayed and tangled, but they haven't been completely severed. The stairs protest under my careful descent, each step a small announcement of my approach that I hope goes unnoticed. The house feels different in the darkness, charged with an electricity that makes my skin prickle with anticipation. Whatever has happened, it's changed something fundamental in the delicate ecosystem of this household, shifted the balance in ways I don't yet understand. David stands in the kitchen surrounded by the remains of what was once my good china, the wedding set that Harold and I received 52 years ago and treasured through decades of Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. The delicate roses and gold trim that once made me feel so sophisticated now lie scattered across the linoleum in jagged fragments that catch the light from the single bulb hanging over the sink. He's still in his pajamas, his usually immaculate hair wild with sleep and rage, his face flushed with the kind of fury that transforms familiar features into something almost unrecognizable. In his hand, he clutches a sheaf of papers that look official and threatening, the kind of documents that arrive in thick envelopes with law firm letterheads and change everything. 23 years, he's saying to no one in particular, his voice cracking with emotion I haven't heard since his father's funeral. 23 years of my life dedicated to that firm, and they think they can just discard me like some first-year associate who doesn't know a brief from emotion. Susan appears in the doorway wearing her practical cotton nightgown, her face pale with worry and something else I can't quite identify. There's a calculation in her expression, the look of someone running numbers in her head and not liking the results. She notices me hovering in the shadows but doesn't acknowledge my presence, too focused on the disaster unfolding in front of her. "David, please," she says, her voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying to talk down a volatile situation. "Breaking dishes isn't going to solve anything. We need to think rationally about this." "Rationally?" David laughs, but there's no humor in the sound. It's the bitter laughter of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "They gave my partnership to Jenkins, who couldn't argue his way out of a parking ticket. They said I was too aggressive, too difficult to work with. Me, who's brought in more billable hours than anyone else in that firm for the past 5 years. The papers in his hand crumple as his grip tightens, and I can see now that they're not just any documents. They're termination papers, the kind that end careers and shatter illusions about job security and professional success. My son, the golden boy who graduated summa cum laude and landed a position at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, has been fired. There has to be some mistake, Susan says, but even she doesn't sound convinced. Maybe if you call Harrison in the morning, explain your side of things. There is no mistake, David snarls, and I watch as he deliberately steps on one of the larger pieces of broken china, grinding it under his heel with a satisfaction that makes my stomach turn. Harrison was in the room when they delivered the news. He sat there like a coward and let them destroy me. The implications of what I'm witnessing begin to settle over me like a heavy blanket. David's income, his prestigious position, the respect he commanded in professional circles, all of it is gone. And with it, the financial security that this household depends on, the comfortable lifestyle that my presence here has been such an expensive burden to maintain. What about severance? Susan asks, her teacher's practicality cutting through the emotional chaos. There must be some kind of package, some transition assistance. David's laugh is even more bitter this time, and he waves the crumpled papers in her face, like evidence of betrayal. 2 weeks' pay and a promise not to contest my unemployment benefits if I sign a non-disclosure agreement. 23 years of loyalty, and they're buying my silence for the cost of their Christmas party budget. 2 weeks' pay. I do the mental arithmetic automatically, a skill honed through decades of managing household budgets and stretching dollars to cover necessities. 2 weeks of David's salary, even his substantial salary, won't last long in a house with a mortgage, car payments, and the countless expenses that come with maintaining an upper-middle-class lifestyle. We'll figure this out, Susan says, but I can hear the panic creeping into her voice. I have my job, and there are other firms in the city. Someone will recognize your talent. My talent? David's voice rises to a dangerous pitch, and I see him eyeing the remaining intact dishes with a look that promises more destruction. My reputation is ruined. Word travels fast in legal circles, and by morning, everyone will know that I was fired for cause. No respectable firm will touch me. The truth of our situation begins to crystallize with horrible clarity. Without David's income, this household will struggle to meet its basic obligations. The mortgage, the car payments, the private school tuition for the children, all of it balanced on the assumption of continued prosperity that has just evaporated. In a conference room filled with senior partners and termination papers. And in the middle of this financial catastrophe sits me, the expensive burden they can no longer afford to maintain. The unwanted houseguest who requires medical care and prescriptions and all the costly necessities of keeping an elderly person alive and functional. I can see the calculation forming in both their minds, the cold arithmetic that will determine my fate in the coming weeks. Maybe, Susan says carefully, testing the words like someone walking across thin ice. Maybe we need to consider all our options. Make some difficult decisions about expenses we can't afford anymore. Her eyes flick to me standing in the shadows, and the message is unmistakable. I am an expense they can no longer afford, a luxury item that must be eliminated from the household. Budget. The assisted living brochures that have been appearing with increasing frequency suddenly make perfect sense. They weren't planning for my eventual care. They were planning for my removal. The Sunset Manor has an opening, Susan continues, her voice gaining confidence as she warms to the topic. It's not the nicest facility, but it's affordable, and they accept Medicaid applications. We could have her settled there by the end of the month. Her, not Mom, not Meredith, just her, as if I'm a piece of unwanted furniture that needs to be disposed of before the moving truck arrives. I grip my cane tighter, the carved handle digging into my palm as I struggle to process the casual way. They're discussing my future without my input. The waiting list, David says, his anger shifting into something more calculating and equally dangerous. Last time we called, they said it could be months before they had an opening. That was for the better rooms, Susan replies, and I can hear the wheels turning in her head. The shared rooms are available immediately. She doesn't need privacy, at her age, and the cost savings would be significant. A shared room at Sunset Manor. I've heard about Sunset Manor from other elderly people at the doctor's office, the whispered warnings about understaffed facilities and neglected residents, and the kind of institutional care that prioritizes profit over human dignity. The thought of spending my remaining years in such a place, sharing a room with a stranger while slowly fading into irrelevance, fills me with a terror I haven't felt since Harold's diagnosis. How much? David asks, his lawyer's mind already working through the financial implications. $1,800 a month for the shared room, plus additional fees for medications and personal care assistance. Her Social Security would cover about half, and we'd need to make up the difference until her Medicaid application is approved. $900 a month. The number hangs in the air between them like a judgment, a price tag attached to my continued existence. $900 to warehouse me somewhere out of sight, somewhere I can slowly deteriorate without inconveniencing their daily lives or reminding them of the promises they made when I gave up my independence to move in with them. It's better than keeping her here, Susan continues, emboldened by David's silence. The medical supervision alone would be worth the cost, and we wouldn't have to worry about accidents or emergencies. Plus, she'd have activities and social interaction with people her own age. Activities, social interaction. The euphemisms roll off her tongue with practiced ease, as if she's already rehearsed this conversation in her head multiple times. But I know what those words really mean in places like Sunset Manor. Bingo games led by bored volunteers, craft projects designed for failing minds, the hollow simulation of community among people who have been deposited there by families eager to forget them. David sets the crumpled papers on the counter and begins pacing, his bare feet crunching on the broken china with each step. The sound makes me wince, but he seems oblivious to the destruction he's causing, too focused on the larger catastrophe of his professional ruin to notice the smaller disasters in his wake. We need to cut expenses everywhere, he mutters, more to himself than to Susan. Cancel the club membership, trade in the BMW, maybe pull the kids out of St. Catherine's, and send them to public school. Each item on his mental list represents another step down from the lifestyle they've worked so hard to achieve, another compromise with the reality of reduced circumstances. But none of these sacrifices would be as complete or as final as my removal from their lives, my exile to an institution where I can be forgotten with a clear conscience and a reasonable monthly payment. The sooner we make the transition, the better, Susan says, and I can hear her shifting into her teacher mode, the practical voice she uses when explaining difficult concepts to reluctant students. It's not fair to her to delay the inevitable, and the longer we wait, the harder it will be for everyone involved. Not fair to me. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. Nothing about my life in this house has been fair, from the moment I walked through their front door with my single suitcase and surrendered my independence for the promise of family care and support. The daily indignities, the casual cruelties, the systematic erosion of my dignity and autonomy, none of it has been fair. But this conversation, this clinical discussion of my disposal, represents a new level of unfairness that takes my breath away. They're not just planning to abandon me. They're convincing themselves that they're doing it for my own good, that institutional care is somehow superior to the grudging shelter they've provided. I'll call them in the morning, David decides, his voice carrying the finality of a judge, pronouncing sentence. Set up a tour, get the paperwork started. The sooner we can make this transition, the better for everyone involved. Everyone. As if my opinion matters, as if my feelings are part of the equation they're solving. I want to step forward, to remind them that I'm standing right here, that I can hear every word of their planning and calculation. I want to demand a voice in decisions about my own life, to assert the basic human right to participate in conversations about my future. But I know better. Speaking up now would only accelerate their timeline, give them an excuse to frame my resistance as confusion or obstinacy that proves their point about my need for professional care. Better to remain silent, to gather information and consider my options while they believe I'm unaware of their intentions. The conversation winds down with the tired efficiency of people who have made an unpleasant but necessary decision. Susan begins picking up the larger pieces of broken china while David retreats to his home office, probably to begin researching unemployment benefits and job search strategies. Neither of them acknowledges my presence as I slowly climb the stairs back to my room, my cane tapping against each step like a countdown to my own extinction. Back in my narrow bed, I stare at the ceiling and try to process what I've just witnessed. The comfortable illusion of family loyalty has been shattered as completely as my wedding china, revealing the cold calculation that lies beneath their superficial care. I am not their beloved mother deserving of love and respect. I am a financial liability that must be eliminated as quickly and quietly as possible. But something else has been revealed in that late-night confrontation, something that might be more important than their casual cruelty. David's professional collapse has exposed the precarious nature of their financial situation, the thin margin between comfortable prosperity and desperate scrambling. And in that desperation, I might find an opportunity I hadn't previously considered. I think about Harold again, about those final conversations we had about money and security and making sure I would be taken care of. His insistence that I understand our financial situation, his repeated questions about whether I knew where all the important papers were kept, his almost obsessive concern about details that seemed so much less important than his failing health. The safe deposit box, he had said during one of our last coherent conversations. You remember about the safe deposit box, don't you, Meredith? Everything important is there. Everything you'll need. At the time, I had assumed he was talking about our wills and insurance policies, the routine documents that any responsible couple would keep secure. But what if there was more? What if Harold, in his careful way, had prepared for possibilities that neither of us wanted to discuss openly? The key is in my jewelry box, hidden behind the false backing that Harold installed years ago when we still had valuable things worth protecting. I haven't looked at it since his funeral, haven't had any reason to visit the bank or access whatever papers he left there. But tomorrow, while David and Susan are making their plans for my disposal, maybe it's time I made some plans of my own. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by dreams of institutions and abandonment, of locked doors and shared rooms with strangers who smell like disinfectant and despair. But underneath the nightmares runs a thread of something else, something that feels almost like hope. Harold was a careful man, a man who planned for contingencies and prepared for possibilities that others preferred to ignore. Tomorrow I will discover what plans he made for me, what resources he set aside for the day when I would need them most. And if I'm very lucky, if Harold was as thorough as I remember him being, tomorrow might be the day I stop being a victim of other people's decisions and start taking control of my own destiny. The morning arrives gray and unwelcoming, matching my mood as I prepare for what I know will be a difficult day. David has already left for what I assume are job hunting activities, though I suspect a good portion of his day will be spent at the country club bar, drowning his professional sorrows in expensive scotch and the sympathy of friends who are secretly relieved that someone else's career has imploded instead of their own. Susan moves through the house with the brisk efficiency of someone checking items off a mental list, her phone pressed to her ear as she makes the calls that will determine my future. I can hear fragments of her conversations from my position. At the kitchen table, clinical discussions about admission procedures and waiting lists and payment arrangements that reduce my life to a series of administrative tasks. Yes, we're interested in immediate placement if possible, she says to someone at Sunset Manor, her voice carrying the false cheer of someone negotiating an unpleasant transaction. She's very low maintenance, no special dietary requirements or behavioral issues, just the normal care needs for someone her age. Low maintenance, normal care needs. The language of institutional processing, designed to make human beings sound like inventory items that can be categorized and stored efficiently. I wonder if this is how she talks about her students when they become problems that need to be solved, reducing complex young lives to simple administrative categories. The children are at school, blissfully unaware that their grandmother is being discussed and disposed of like an unwanted piece of furniture. Part of me wants to tell them what's happening, to see if there's any genuine affection buried beneath the indifference their parents have taught them. But I know better than to involve children in adult decisions, especially children who have been trained to see me as irrelevant to their daily lives. By noon, Susan has made her arrangements. A tour at 2 o'clock, paperwork to be completed by the end of the week, move-in scheduled for the following Monday if everything goes smoothly. 5 days. I have 5 days to either accept my fate or find an alternative that no one expects me to possess. Mom, Susan says, finally acknowledging my presence now that all the important decisions have been made without my input. We need to talk about your future care needs. She sits across from me at the kitchen table, adopting the patient tone she probably uses with struggling students who need difficult concepts explained to them. Her expression is kind but firm, the look of someone who has made an unpalatable decision for the greater good and expects gratitude for her sacrifice. David and I have been discussing your situation, she continues, as if my situation is something abstract that exists independently of my actual feelings or preferences. With his recent job transition, we need to make some adjustments to our household arrangements. Job transition. Even now, she can't bring herself to use the word fired, can't acknowledge that David's professional life has collapsed in spectacular fashion. The euphemisms are as much for her own comfort as mine, a way of maintaining the illusion that they're still the successful, respectable family they've worked so hard to become. We've found a wonderful facility that specializes in care for people. Your age, she says, producing a glossy brochure that features the same smiling elderly people I've seen in all the assisted living advertisements. Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation, and they have immediate availability. I take the brochure with hands that tremble slightly, whether from age or anger I'm not entirely sure. The photographs show cheerful common areas and well-appointed rooms, the kind of staged perfection that exists only in marketing materials. But I've learned to read between the lines of such presentations, to see past the carefully curated images to the reality they're designed to obscure. It looks very nice, I say quietly, because agreeing seems safer than arguing at this point. When would this transition happen? Next Monday, Susan replies, and I can hear the relief in her voice that I'm not fighting her on this. That gives us the weekend to pack your things and make sure you have everything you need for the move. Everything I need. As if my needs are simple things that can be packed in boxes and transported like household goods. As if 78 years of life can be condensed into whatever fits in the trunk of David's car, with the rest discarded as no longer relevant to my reduced circumstances. I understand, I tell her, though understanding and accepting are very different things. This must be difficult for you too. The expression that crosses her face is complex, a mixture of guilt and relief, and something that might be genuine, sadness. For a moment, I catch a glimpse of the little girl who used to climb into my lap when she was scared, who trusted me to make everything better when her world felt dangerous and uncertain. It is difficult, she admits, her professional composure slipping slightly. But it's the right thing to do. You'll have professional care, activities with people your own age, medical supervision around the clock. It's really the best situation for everyone involved. Everyone involved. There's that phrase again, the magical justification that transforms abandonment into altruism that makes cruelty sound like kindness. But I nod anyway, maintaining the facade of grateful acceptance while my mind races through possibilities and calculations. I'd like to visit the bank this afternoon, I tell her, making my voice sound casual and unconcerned. There are some papers I need to retrieve from our safe deposit box, documents I might need for the facility's paperwork. Susan's expression sharpens slightly, the teacher's instinct for spotting students who might be planning something unauthorized. What kind of papers? I thought we had copies of everything important. Just some old insurance documents, I lie smoothly, decades of marriage having taught me the value of strategic omissions. Harold was very thorough about keeping records, and I want to make sure I have everything the facility might require. It's a reasonable request, the kind of practical preparation that Susan appreciates in her students and should approve of in her mother. After a moment's hesitation, she nods and reaches for her car keys, probably calculating whether she has time to fit this errand into her schedule before the tour at Sunset Manor. I suppose we should take care of that sooner rather than later, she agrees. And while we're out, we can stop by the facility for your tour. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. 2 birds with 1 stone, the casual efficiency with which she plans. To dispose of my independence and tour my future prison would be impressive if it weren't so terrifying. But I smile and thank her for her thoughtfulness, playing the role of the cooperative elderly mother while my heart hammers with anticipation and dread. The drive to the bank passes in relative silence. Susan focused on her mental list of tasks while I stare out the window at a world I'm about to be removed from permanently. The familiar streets and businesses take on a poignant quality, like scenes from a life I'm viewing for the last time. Tomorrow, I might not have the freedom to ask for a drive to the bank or anywhere else. Tomorrow, my world will shrink to the dimensions of whatever room they assign me at Sunset Manor. First National. Bank is an imposing granite building that has anchored the corner of Main and 3rd Street for as long as I can remember. Harold and I opened our first joint account here 53 years ago, fresh-faced newlyweds who thought we understood what forever meant. The lobby is unchanged since his death, all marble floors and brass fixtures that speak to the kind of institutional permanence that individual lives can't match. Mrs. Henderson, the branch manager who handled Harold's funeral arrangements and the transfer of our accounts, greets me with genuine warmth and professional sympathy. She's a woman about Susan's age who has managed to retain the kind of personal service that larger banks have abandoned in favor of efficiency and profit margins. Mrs. Caldwell, she says, extending her hand with a smile that reaches her eyes. How nice to see you again. How can we help you today? I need to access our safe deposit box, I tell her, producing the small key that has been hidden in my jewelry case for the past 2 years. There are some documents I need to review. The process is simple but formal, requiring identification and signature verification and the kind of bureaucratic precision that banks have perfected over decades of handling other people's valuables. Susan waits in the lobby while Mrs. Henderson escorts me to the vault, a windowless room lined with numbered metal boxes that contain the secrets and treasures of countless lives. Box 247 is smaller than I remembered, about the size of a shoebox, but infinitely more significant. Harold's hands were the last to touch its contents, his careful mind the architect of whatever preparations wait inside. As Mrs. Henderson opens the lock and slides the box across the table, I feel like an archaeologist about to uncover artifacts from a civilization I thought I understood completely. The first items are exactly what I expected. Our wills, insurance policies, the deed to our old house, Harold's military discharge papers from his brief service during the Korean conflict. Familiar documents that tell the official story of our life together. The paper trail that proves we existed and accumulated and prepared for the future like responsible citizens. But underneath these expected items lies something I didn't anticipate. A thick manila envelope sealed with Harold's distinctive handwriting that simply says, "For Meredith when you need it most." My fingers tremble as I break the seal, partly from anticipation and partly from the realization that Harold knew this day would come, knew that I would eventually need resources he had set aside without my knowledge. The envelope contains documents that make my breath catch in my throat, papers that reveal a side of our financial life that Harold kept carefully hidden even from me. Stock certificates, bond registrations, account statements from investment firms I've never heard of, all bearing my name as the sole beneficiary and owner. The numbers swimming before my eyes are staggering, zeros that multiply until they lose meaning and become something almost abstract. Harold, my careful husband who worried about every grocery bill and questioned every unnecessary expense, had been quietly building a fortune that dwarfs anything I imagined we possessed. $2.7 million. The number appears again and again across different statements and accounts, all of it held in trust arrangements and investment vehicles designed to protect the principal while generating steady income. Harold hadn't just prepared for my future. He had crafted a financial fortress that could withstand any siege, any attempt to control or diminish my resources. But there's more. A letter in Harold's familiar handwriting, dated just 3 weeks before his death, that explains the careful architecture of what he had built for me. "My dearest Meredith," the letter begins, and I can hear his voice in every word, the gentle tone he used when explaining complicated things with infinite patience. "If you're reading this, then the day I feared has arrived, and our children have revealed themselves to be less honorable than we hoped they would be." He knew. Somehow, Harold had seen through their careful performance to the truth beneath, had recognized that the children we raised might not be the people we thought they were. The letter continues with devastating clarity about the protections he had put in place and the resources I would need to defend myself. The accounts are structured so that only you can access them, and only with the specific documentation contained in this envelope. David's legal training will be useless here. These arrangements were crafted by specialists who understand how to protect assets from family members who might not have your best interests at heart. Harold's final gift wasn't just money, it was independence. The power to make my own choices, to refuse their plans for my disposal, to reclaim the dignity they had systematically stripped away. In his careful way, he had anticipated this moment of crisis and provided me with the tools I would need to survive it. The revelation is overwhelming, transformative in ways I'm only beginning to understand. This morning, I was a helpless elderly woman facing exile to an institution. This afternoon, I am a woman of considerable means with options my children never suspected I possessed. The shift in perspective is so dramatic that I feel dizzy, as if the ground beneath my feet has suddenly revealed itself to be an illusion. But with this knowledge comes responsibility and danger. David and Susan have made their plans based on the assumption that I have no resources, no alternatives to the future they've chosen for me. If they discover the truth about Harold's legacy, they will find ways to challenge it, to claim that I'm incompetent to manage such resources, to argue that their control is necessary for my own protection. I must be careful, strategic in ways I haven't needed to be for decades. The helpless elderly mother they think they're disposing of must continue to play that role until I'm ready to reveal the truth. And when that moment comes, it must be devastating and complete, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. Mrs. Henderson returns to escort me back to the lobby, her professional discretion evident in the way she doesn't ask questions about what I've discovered or why I'm moving with such purpose now. Banking, like medicine, requires a certain blindness to the human dramas that unfold within its walls, a commitment to process over personality that protects both institutions and individuals. Susan is checking her watch when I rejoin her, already, calculating whether we have enough time for the tour at Sunset Manor before she needs to collect the children from school. Her impatience is a reminder that my time is running short, that I have only days to plan whatever response Harold's legacy will make possible. "Everything you needed?" she asks, her tone suggesting that we should move quickly to the next item on her agenda. "Yes," I tell her, clutching my purse a little tighter to protect the documents that have just changed everything. "I have everything I need now." The irony of that statement would be amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Susan thinks she's helping me gather paperwork for my admission to an institution. Instead, she's just helped me discover the resources that will allow me to reject their plans entirely. But not yet. Not until I've had time to think, to plan, to prepare for the confrontation that will inevitably come when they discover that their helpless victim is neither helpless nor willing to be victimized any longer. Tomorrow I will begin the careful work of reclaiming my life. Tonight, I will let them continue believing that they hold all the power, that my fate rests entirely in their reluctant hands. It's a performance I've been perfecting for months now, the role of the grateful burden who accepts whatever scraps of dignity they're willing to offer. But Harold's letter has reminded me of something I had almost forgotten in the fog of grief and gradual surrender. I am not just their mother. I am Meredith Caldwell, and I have been stronger than this before. I will be stronger than this again. The tour of Sunset Manor unfolds exactly as I expected it would, a carefully choreographed performance designed to mask the institutional realities behind cheerful facades and professional smiles. The director, a woman named Mrs. Bloom who speaks in the artificially bright tones of someone accustomed to selling unpleasant truths as attractive alternatives, guides us through hallways that smell of industrial disinfectant and something else I can't quite identify but recognize as the scent of places where hope goes to die. Our residents absolutely love the community atmosphere, Mrs. Bloom chirps as we pass a day room where several elderly people sit motionless in wheelchairs, staring at a television that blares some mindless game show to an audience that seems incapable of comprehension. We have activities every day, from arts and crafts to musical entertainment. The residents she's so enthusiastic about look like broken dolls arranged in a display case, their faces vacant and their bodies positioned by staff members who view them as objects to be managed rather than people to be cared for. Some wear clothing that doesn't quite fit properly. Others have stains on their shirts that suggest meals eaten without dignity or assistance. This is what passes for care in places where families deposit their inconvenient elderly relatives. Susan nods approvingly at everything Mrs. Bloom shows us, asking practical questions about meal schedules and medication management and visiting hours with the efficiency of someone purchasing a service rather than arranging care for someone she supposedly loves. I follow silently, playing the role of the compliant elderly woman who has no choice but to accept whatever arrangements others make for her. The shared rooms are quite spacious, Mrs. Bloom continues, opening the door to reveal a cramped space barely large enough for 2 narrow beds, 2 small dressers, and a single chair positioned between them. The window looks out onto the facilities parking lot, where a few sad trees struggle to survive in the exhaust fumes and neglect. Residents often become close friends when they room together. It's like having a built-in companion. A companion, the roommate assignment would be made, based on bed availability and payment schedules rather than compatibility or preference. I would be expected to share this tiny space with a stranger, someone else's discarded family member who might be dealing with dementia or incontinence or any number of conditions that would make privacy impossible and dignity extinct. What about personal belongings? I ask quietly, the first question I've posed during this entire tour. How much can residents bring with them? Mrs. Bloom's smile becomes slightly strained, the look of someone who has answered this question many times and never enjoys the honest response. We encourage residents to bring items that have special meaning, of course, but space is limited. In shared accommodations, most people find they need much less than they thought once they settle into our community lifestyle. Community lifestyle. Another euphemism for the systematic stripping away of everything that makes a person individual and unique. My books would be condensed to whatever could fit in a single drawer. My photographs would be limited to what could be displayed on half of a small dresser. The accumulated treasures of 78 years would be reduced to whatever essentials could be crammed into a space smaller than most people's closets. The dining room serves meals at set times, Mrs. Bloom explains as we pass a cafeteria-style space where residents sit at long tables, eating from plastic plates with plastic utensils while staff members hover nearby to prevent incidents. We've found that structured mealtimes help residents maintain healthy routines and provide natural opportunities for socialization. Structured meal times, natural socialization, the language of institutional control dressed up as beneficial programming. These people aren't dining. They're being fed according to schedules designed for staff convenience rather than resident comfort. The conversations I can observe are sparse and stilted, the kind of awkward interactions that happen when strangers are forced into proximity without any genuine basis for connection. The tour concludes in Mrs. Bloom's office, a space that manages to be both sterile and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets and motivational posters that proclaim the facility's commitment to dignity and respect. The paperwork she spreads across her desk tells a different story. Forms that reduce human beings to medical conditions and insurance coverage. Contracts that prioritize the facility's liability protection over resident rights. The admission process is quite straightforward, Mrs. Bloom explains, producing a thick packet of documents that would require several hours to review properly. We'll need medical records, insurance information, next of kin contacts, and of course the first month's payment to secure the room. The first month's payment. $1,800 to purchase my exile from family life, my relegation to this warehouse for inconvenient elderly people. Susan writes the check without hesitation, her signature sealing my fate with the same casual efficiency she might use to pay a utility bill. Wonderful, Mrs. Bloom beams, filing the check away with practiced speed. Mrs. Caldwell can move in this Monday morning. We'll have everything ready for her arrival. Everything ready. A bed in a shared room, a drawer for my remaining possessions, a chair in the day room where I can wait for death while pretending to enjoy activities designed for minds that have already surrendered to confusion and despair. This is what my children have purchased for me with money they can't afford. A solution to the problem of my continued existence that allows them to feel virtuous about their abandonment. The drive home passes in near silence, Susan apparently satisfied that she has accomplished something important and beneficial. I sit beside her, clutching my purse, feeling the weight of Harold's documents against my side like a secret weapon that no one suspects I possess. The power to reject their plans, to reclaim my independence, to demonstrate that their calculations about my helplessness were catastrophically wrong. But that power comes with risks I'm only beginning to understand. David's legal training, however compromised by his recent professional collapse, would allow him to mount challenges to my competency if he discovered the extent of Harold's legacy. Susan's teaching background includes dealing with difficult parents and administrative conflicts, skills she could adapt to questioning my ability to manage significant financial resources. They would argue that my age makes me vulnerable to exploitation, that my grief over Harold's death has left me susceptible to poor judgment, that the stress of institutional placement has triggered some form of cognitive decline. The very system, designed to protect elderly people from financial abuse, could be weaponized against me by the people who are supposed to love and protect me. That evening, I sit in my narrow room surrounded by the detritus of a life that's about to be packed into boxes and condensed to whatever fits in half of a shared space at Sunset Manor. The superhero posters on the walls seem to mock my situation, reminders of childhood fantasies about justice and heroism, in a world where the real villains are often the people who share your last name. Below me, I can hear David and Susan discussing the logistics of my removal with the same tone they might use to plan a vacation or organize a garage sale. Who will pack my belongings? What time the facility expects my arrival? Whether they should rent a truck or make multiple trips in their cars. The practical details of erasing me from their lives, handled with efficient indifference to the emotional impact on the person being erased. She seems to be taking it well. Susan's voice drifts up through the thin floor. Better than I expected, honestly. Maybe she realizes it's for the best. For the best. The phrase that transforms cruelty into kindness, that makes abandonment sound like altruism. But what if I'm not taking it well? What if I'm simply better at hiding my feelings than they are at reading them? What if the compliant elderly mother they think they understand is actually someone far more complex and resourceful than they've bothered to discover? The next morning brings a flurry of activity as Susan begins the process of reducing my life to its supposedly essential components. She moves through my belongings with ruthless efficiency, sorting items into categories that reflect her assumptions about what matters to an elderly woman facing institutional placement. "You'll want to keep the photographs, of course," she says, gathering my albums and framed pictures into a small pile. "And maybe one or two of your favorite books, though the facility has a library." 1 or 2 books. From a collection that numbers in the hundreds, accumulated over decades of reading and rereading, I'm allowed to choose 1 or 2 volumes to accompany me into exile. The rest will be donated or discarded, my intellectual history condensed, to whatever can fit in a small box alongside my medication organizer and compression stockings. "What about my jewelry?" I ask, thinking about the pieces Harold gave me over the years, the earrings for our anniversary, the necklace for my 50th birthday, the wedding ring that still feels strange to wear without his matching band beside. "Bring the simple pieces," Susan advises, holding up a pair of pearl earrings that Harold bought me for our 10th anniversary. "Nothing too valuable in case of theft or loss. Facilities like this have problems with items going missing." Theft or loss. My jewelry, chosen with love and given with ceremony, reduced to potential security risks that must be managed through strategic abandonment. The valuable pieces, the ones with genuine meaning and emotional significance, will be locked away or sold because they don't fit the image of appropriate possessions for someone in my situation. "I'd like to keep my wedding china," I say, remembering the set that David destroyed in his rage just days ago. "The pieces that are still intact." Susan pauses in her sorting, a flicker of guilt crossing her face as she remembers the circumstances that led to the china's destruction. "There's really no place for dishes at the facility," she says carefully. "They provide all the dining ware, and residents aren't allowed to keep breakable items in their rooms." Of course they're not. My wedding china, the symbol of hope and commitment that Harold and I chose together 52 years ago, the dishes we used for every important meal and celebration of our marriage, would be inappropriate baggage for institutional living. Better to leave them behind, broken pieces of a life that no longer fits the reduced circumstances I'm expected to accept. The weekend passes in a blur of decisions made without my input and belongings sorted according to other people's judgments about what matters in an elderly woman's life. My clothing is reduced to a few practical outfits suitable for institutional living. My books become a small stack of romance novels that Susan apparently considers appropriate reading for someone my age. My furniture stays behind, too large and impractical for the shared space where I'll finish out my days. By Sunday evening, my life has been compressed into 3 cardboard boxes and a single suitcase. The entire accumulation of nearly 8 decades reduced to what Susan considers essential for my new circumstances. The room that was never really mine begins to look like itself again, ready for whatever use David and Susan have planned for the space once I'm gone. "I think we've got everything important," Susan announces, surveying the packed boxes with satisfaction. "You'll be surprised how much you don't miss once you settle in at Sunset Manor." How much I don't miss. The photographs that didn't make the cut. The books deemed inappropriate for my new situation. The clothing that represents who I used to be rather than who I'm expected to become. According to Susan's calculations, these losses will be easy to accept once I adjust to the reduced expectations of institutional living. But Susan's calculations are based on incomplete information, assumptions about my resources and options that Harold's careful planning has rendered obsolete. Tonight, while they sleep peacefully in the confidence that they've solved the problem of my existence, I'm making plans they never imagined I could make. The documents from Harold's safe deposit box lie spread across my narrow bed like battle plans, revealing the true scope of the financial resources that will allow me to reject their solution entirely. But more than that, they reveal Harold's faith in my ability to fight for myself when the time came, his confidence that the woman he married was strong enough to use these resources wisely and effectively. Tomorrow morning, while they prepare To drive me to Sunset Manor, I will reveal the truth about Harold's legacy and my intentions for my own future. The helpless elderly woman they think they're disposing of will transform into someone with power they never suspected. Resources they never imagined and plans they never considered possible. But tonight, I allow myself to grieve for the family I thought I had, the children I believed would love and protect me in my old age. The David and Susan who exist in my memory, the ones who brought me flowers on Mother's Day and called me for advice about their problems, those people are gone. In their place are strangers who see me as a burden to be managed, rather than a mother to be cherished. The loss is profound and permanent, the kind of betrayal that changes everything about how you understand your place in the world. But from that loss comes clarity about what I must do next, the actions Harold's legacy makes possible and necessary. I think about Harold's letter, about his prediction that this day would come and his preparation for my response to it. He knew our children better than I wanted to admit, saw through their performance to the calculation beneath. His love for me included the recognition that I would need to be strong in ways I had never been strong before, independent in ways that our marriage had never required. "You are more capable than you remember," he had written in his final paragraph. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Don't let their convenience become your prison. Fight for the life you deserve, not the life they think you should accept. Fight for the life I deserve. Tomorrow I will begin that fight with weapons Harold provided, and knowledge he made sure I would possess when I needed it most. The battle will be difficult and painful, requiring me to confront the ugly reality of who my children have become and what they're willing to do to solve the problem of my continued existence. But I will not go quietly to the exile they've planned for me. I will not accept their version of what my life should look like or who I should become to accommodate their convenience. I am Meredith Caldwell, widow of Harold Caldwell, mother of David and Susan, and I have resources they never suspected and strength they have chosen to underestimate. Monday morning arrives with the false promise of a new beginning, sunlight streaming through my window as if this day were any other day, instead of the one where everything changes. I dress carefully in my best remaining outfit, the navy dress, with small flowers that Susan thinks makes me look old, but that Harold always said brought out the blue in my eyes. Today, I dress not for invisibility, but for impact, for the moment when I step out of the role they've written for me and into the truth they never bothered to discover. The boxes containing my condensed life sit by the door like accusations, evidence of how little they think matters about who I am and who I've been. But hidden in my purse are the documents that will transform this morning from a surrender into a reckoning, papers that prove Harold's wisdom and reveal my children's profound miscalculation about what they could force me to accept. David appears, at my door exactly on time, his expression combining duty with distaste in equal measure. He's dressed for the office despite being unemployed, maintaining the appearance of professional competence even as his career lies in ruins. His gaze sweeps over the packed boxes with satisfaction, as if my reduced circumstances validate his decisions about my future. "Ready?" he asks, though it's not really a question. In his mind, my readiness is irrelevant to the schedule he's established for my removal from his life. "Almost," I tell him, settling into the chair by my window, "for what I intend to be the last few minutes I spend in this room that was never truly mine. There's something we need to discuss first." David checks his watch with the impatience of someone who has allocated a specific amount of time for this task and doesn't want to exceed it. "Can't it wait? Mrs. Bloom is expecting us at 9, and I have appointments this afternoon." Appointments? Job interviews, most likely, or meetings with headhunters who might be able to salvage something from his ruined reputation. His professional collapse has made him more desperate and therefore more dangerous, more willing to take extreme measures to solve problems that threaten his remaining stability. "It can't wait," I say firmly, using a tone I haven't employed, "with my children in months." "Sit down, David. Susan should hear this too." Something in my voice must convince him that this isn't the routine compliance he's come to expect from me. He calls for Susan, who appears in the doorway with her car keys in hand and irritation written across her face. They both remain standing, as if sitting would somehow legitimize whatever inconvenient delay I'm about to impose on their carefully planned schedule. "What's this about, Mom?" Susan asks, checking her own watch. "We really do need to get going if we're going to be on time. On time for my exile. On time for the disposal of their unwanted burden. On time for the beginning of their lives without the inconvenience of caring for their elderly mother." But they're about to discover that their timeline and their assumptions are both about to be dramatically altered. I reach into my purse and withdraw the manila envelope that Harold sealed with such care. The documents that will change everything about this morning and everything about our relationship. The papers feel heavier than they should, weighted with the power to transform me from victim to victor in a single moment of revelation. "Your father left me some things," I begin, opening the envelope with deliberate care. "Important things that I've only recently discovered." David's expression sharpens, his legal training alerting him to the possibility that whatever I'm about to reveal could complicate his carefully laid plans. Susan moves closer, her teacher's instinct for trouble finally activated by something she can't quite identify, but definitely doesn't like. "What kind of things?" David asks, his voice carrying the cautious tone of someone who suspects bad news, but hasn't yet identified its source. I spread the financial documents across my bed like playing cards in a high-stakes game, watching their faces as they recognize account statements and investment certificates and numbers that don't match anything they thought they knew about our financial situation. The shock on their faces is gratifying in ways I hadn't expected, the first crack in their confidence about controlling my future. "Harold was more careful with money than either of us realized," I say, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "Much more careful." Susan picks up one of the account statements, her eyes widening as she processes the balance shown on the quarterly report. "This says $200,000, she whispers, as if speaking too loudly might make the number disappear. "That's just one account," I tell her, watching as David grabs another statement and then another, his face growing paler with each document he examines. "There are several." The silence that follows is profound and complete, the kind of quiet that comes when people are forced to recalculate everything they thought they understood about their situation. David's unemployment and financial desperation, their inability to afford keeping me in their home, their certainty that institutional care was the only option, all of it built on assumptions about my poverty that Harold's planning has revealed to be completely false. "How much?" David asks finally, his lawyer's mind working through the implications, even as his face shows the shock of discovery. "Enough," I tell him, using the same tone he's used with me when discussing my future without my input. "More than enough to take care of myself without being a burden to anyone." Burden. The word hangs between us like an accusation, a reminder of how they've characterized my presence in their lives and their eagerness to transfer my care to strangers who would manage me for a monthly fee. But I'm not their burden anymore. Haven't been since the moment I discovered Harold's gift of independence. "This changes things," Susan says slowly, her practical mind already working through the implications for their plans and their timeline. "If you have resources, then maybe institutional care isn't necessary." Maybe. Such a small word to describe such a massive reversal, the transformation of their certainty into uncertainty with the revelation of Harold's careful planning. But it's too late for maybe. Too late for reconsidering plans they made without consulting me or caring about my preferences. "You're right," I agree, beginning to gather the documents back into their envelope. "It does change things. I won't be going to Sunset Manor today or any other day." The finality in my voice seems to shock them more than the financial documents did. The realization that I'm not asking for their permission or seeking their approval for my decision. I'm informing them of my intentions, not negotiating the terms of my future with people who have forfeited any claim to input about my life. But the arrangements are already made, David protests, his voice carrying the petulance of someone who doesn't like having his plans disrupted. The deposit is paid, the room is reserved, they're expecting you this morning. They're expecting Not we're expecting to take you there, but they're expecting you, as if he's already removed himself from any responsibility for the consequences of plans made in my name. But those plans were made based on false assumptions about my helplessness, calculations that Harold's foresight has rendered obsolete. Then you'll need to call and cancel, I tell him, standing up from my chair with more authority than I've felt in months. Explain that there's been a change in circumstances. Change in circumstances. The same euphemistic language they've used to describe my exile, now repurposed to describe my liberation from their plans. But this change is real and permanent, a shift in power that no amount of legal maneuvering or emotional manipulation can reverse. Susan's face shows a complex mixture of emotions, relief, and disappointment, and something that might be anger at having her efficient solution to the problem of my existence suddenly snatched away. "What about our arrangements?" she asks. "What about the plans we've made?" Our arrangements. Plans we've made. As if I were a willing participant in the process of my own disposal, a collaborator in the scheme to exile me to institutional care. But their arrangements were made without my consent and based on lies about my options, and I'm under no obligation to honor agreements I never made. "You'll need to make new arrangements," I tell her, my voice carrying a firmness I haven't used in far too long. Arrangements that don't include me. The implications of my statement begin to sink in, the realization that I'm not just refusing to go to Sunset Manor, but rejecting my place in their household entirely. The problem they thought they were solving by shipping me off to institutional care will now be solved in a different way, by my departure from their lives entirely. "Where will you go?" David asks, his practical mind already wondering whether my leaving solves his problems or creates new ones. "What will you do? Where will I go? What will I do?" The questions of someone who has never considered that I might have preferences about my own life, that I might have dreams and plans and desires that exist independently of their convenience. But Harold's legacy has given me options they never imagined I could possess, freedom they never thought I would claim. "I'll figure it out," I tell him, enjoying the way my certainty seems to unnerve him. I have resources now, remember? I can afford to make my own decisions about my future. The power dynamic in the room has shifted completely. The transformation from helpless dependent to independent woman, with options accomplished in the space of a single conversation. They still don't understand the full extent of Harold's planning, or the magnitude of the resources at my disposal. But they understand enough to know that their plans for me are finished. "This is insane," David says, his voice rising with frustration and something that sounds like panic. "You can't just decide to leave. You need care, supervision, help with daily activities." Can't just decide to leave, according to whom, based on what authority? For months I've accepted their pronouncements about what I need and what I can't do, but their authority was based on my dependence, and my dependence was based on ignorance about Harold's preparations for exactly this situation. "I've been taking care of myself for 78 years, I remind him, feeling strength returning to my voice with each word. "I think I can manage a little longer." The conversation continues for another hour, David and Susan alternating between anger and bargaining as they try to understand how their carefully laid plans have been so completely disrupted. They question my mental competency, my ability to manage significant financial resources, my capacity to live independently at my age. But their arguments carry no weight against Harold's documents and my newfound determination to reclaim my life. Eventually, they realize that nothing they say will change my mind, that the compliant elderly mother they thought they understood has been replaced by someone with power and options they never suspected existed. The boxes packed for my exile to Sunset Manor will be unpacked, but not because I'm staying in their house. They'll be unpacked because I'm going somewhere else entirely, somewhere of my own choosing. As they leave my room to make the phone calls that will unravel their plans, I sit back down in my chair by the window and look out at a world that suddenly seems full of possibilities instead of limitations. Harold's legacy isn't just financial, it's the gift of choice. The power to determine my own future instead of accepting whatever arrangements others make for my convenience. Tomorrow, I will begin the process of finding a new place to live, somewhere that's truly mine instead of borrowed space in someone else's life. I'll hire help if I need it, but it will be help I choose and pay for, not charity grudgingly provided by people who see me as a burden. I'll make new friends, pursue interests that matter to me, live according to my own schedule and preferences instead of arranging my existence around other people's convenience. The woman who walked into this house 2 years ago, broken by grief and willing to accept whatever scraps of belonging were offered, is gone. In her place stands someone Harold knew I could become if I had the resources and the reason to fight for myself. Today, I found both, and everything that follows will be different because of what I've discovered about my own strength and value. I am Meredith Caldwell, and I am free. 3 weeks have passed since I revealed Harold's secret legacy, and the silence from David and Susan has been deafening. No phone calls checking on my well-being, no visits to see how I'm managing on my own, no acknowledgement that they might have misjudged my capabilities or my worth. Their absence speaks louder than any words could, confirming what I've come to understand about the transactional nature of their love. I've rented a furnished apartment in Willowbrook Gardens, a senior community that offers independence with optional services rather than institutional control with mandatory compliance. My new home has large windows that face east toward the sunrise, hardwood floors that don't creak with accumulated resentment, and walls that have never echoed with conversations about my disposal. For the first time in 2 years, I wake up each morning in a space that belongs to me. The apartment came with a small kitchen where I can prepare my own meals according to my own schedule, eat from my own dishes without permission or apology. I've purchased new china to replace what David destroyed in his rage. Delicate pieces with blue flowers that remind me of the garden Harold and I tended together during our early years of marriage. Each meal is a small celebration of autonomy, a reminder that I can nourish myself without depending on the grudging charity of people who resent my existence. Mrs. Patricia Henley, my neighbor across the hall, knocked on my door the second day. I was here with a plate of homemade cookies and a warmth I hadn't experienced in months. She's 74, a retired librarian whose husband passed 5 years ago, and she possesses the kind of genuine kindness that I'd forgotten existed in human relationships. We've taken to having coffee together most mornings, sharing stories, and laughter without the undercurrent of obligation or resentment that poisoned every interaction in David and Susan's house. "You have such lovely things," Patricia remarked during one of our conversations, admiring the photographs I've arranged on my mantel. "Your family must be so proud of how well you're managing on your own." I hadn't told her about the circumstances. That led to my move, the ugly revelation of how little my children valued my presence in their lives. Instead, I simply smiled and changed the subject, unwilling to burden this new friendship with the complicated grief of discovering that family. Love can be conditional and calculating, but the truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when David's desperation finally overcame his pride, and he began making calls to challenge what he saw as my irrational behavior. The first sign came when Dr. Martinez called to schedule an urgent appointment, her voice carefully neutral but tinged with concern about inquiries she'd received regarding my mental competency. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said when I arrived at her office, "I've had some unusual requests lately for information about your cognitive status and decision-making capacity. I wanted to speak with you directly about any concerns you might have." The careful language couldn't disguise what was happening. David was building a case to challenge my competency, gathering evidence to support a legal claim that I was incapable of managing Harold's legacy responsibly. His legal training, compromised though it might be by his recent firing, was being deployed against me with the ruthless efficiency of someone fighting for his financial survival. My son is concerned about my living arrangements, I told Dr. Martinez, choosing my words as carefully as she had chosen hers. He believes I need more supervision than I'm currently receiving. Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes in my file while her expression remained professionally neutral. But I could see the understanding in her eyes, the recognition that this was about more than medical concerns. She'd treated enough elderly patients to know the difference between genuine family worry and strategic maneuvering disguised as care. "How are you feeling about your current situation?" she asked, leaning back in her chair and giving me her full attention. "Are you managing well on your own?" The question opened a floodgate of emotions I'd been carefully controlling since my move to Willowbrook Gardens. Relief at my newfound independence, grief over the loss of family relationships I'd cherished, anger at the calculated cruelty my children had shown me, and underneath it all, a growing strength that Harold's legacy had made possible. "I'm thriving," I told her honestly. "For the first time in 2 years, I'm living according to my own choices and my own schedule. I'm eating meals I enjoy, reading books I select, spending time with people who actually seem pleased by my company. If that's evidence of incompetency, then I suppose I'll have to plead guilty." Dr. Martinez smiled at that, the first genuine warmth she'd shown since this conversation began. "Your vital signs are excellent, your cognitive function shows no signs of decline, and your emotional state appears significantly improved since your last visit. From a medical standpoint, I see no reason for concern about your ability to live independently or manage your own affairs." Her assessment would become crucial evidence in the legal battle that David was already planning, though I didn't realize yet how far he was willing to go to regain control over Harold's legacy. The phone calls to Dr. Martinez were just the beginning of a campaign that would escalate over the following weeks into something resembling warfare. The second sign came when my bank called to report suspicious activity on one of Harold's investment accounts. Someone had attempted to claim power of attorney privileges, presenting documents that purported to show my mental incapacity and their legal authority to act on my behalf. The bank's security department had flagged the attempt as potentially fraudulent, but it represented a level of desperation and calculation that took my breath away. "These documents appear to be legitimate legal forms," the bank representative explained during our phone conversation, "but they're missing proper notarization and judicial approval. Someone is trying very hard to gain access to your accounts." Mrs. Caldwell. Someone. We both knew who someone was, though the bank couldn't say so directly without evidence that would hold up in court. David's legal expertise was being used to probe for weaknesses in Harold's financial fortress, looking for ways to circumvent the protections my husband had so carefully constructed. That evening, I called the attorney whose name Harold had included in his documentation, a man named Robert Thornfield who specialized in elder law and asset protection. His office was in the financial district, occupying several floors of a building that radiated the kind of institutional authority that David's defunct law firm had always aspired to achieve. "Mrs. Caldwell," Mr. Thornfield said when I was shown into his mahogany-paneled office, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Harold spoke of you often, and he was very specific about the protections he wanted in place for exactly this situation." Harold had spoken of me. The phrase warmed something in my chest that had been cold since discovering how little my children valued my presence in their lives. My husband had seen this day coming, had prepared not just financial resources, but legal strategies to protect me from the very people who should have been protecting me themselves. "My son is trying to challenge my competency," I told him, spreading David's attempted power of attorney documents across his desk. "He believes he should have control over my late husband's legacy." Mr. Thornfield examined the papers with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar attempts many times before. His expression grew harder as he read, the look of a professional who found such tactics distasteful even when they were expected. Your husband anticipated this possibility, he said, opening a thick file that bore my name in Harold's careful handwriting. He established multiple layers of protection specifically to prevent family members from accessing your inheritance through competency challenges or emotional manipulation. Multiple layers of protection. Harold's love had taken the form of legal architecture designed to withstand siege, a fortress built from trusts and documentation and professional expertise that would keep me safe from the people who should have been my greatest protectors. The trusts are irrevocable and structured to be challenge-proof, Mr. Thornfield continued, spreading Harold's documents across his desk like battle plans. Even if someone could successfully argue temporary incompetency, which would be nearly impossible given your medical records and current circumstances, they couldn't access the principal or alter the beneficiary designations. Nearly impossible. The qualification worried me. The suggestion that David's legal training might find cracks in Harold's armor that ordinary family members couldn't exploit. My son might be unemployed and desperate, but he was still a trained attorney with 23 years of experience in finding weaknesses in legal documents. What about the attempted power of attorney? I asked, pointing to the papers David had submitted to my bank. Fraudulent and easily challenged, Mr. Thornfield said dismissively. The courts require significant evidence of incompetency before granting such powers, and your son has no medical documentation to support his claims. Dr. Martinez's assessment alone would be enough to defeat this particular attempt. But there would be other attempts, other strategies, other ways for David to try to access what he saw as his rightful inheritance being squandered on my independence. Harold's protections were strong, but they weren't impregnable against someone, with legal training and nothing left to lose. There's something else, Mr. Thornfield said, his voice taking on a different quality that made me pay closer attention. Harold included specific instructions about what should happen if family members attempted to challenge your autonomy or access your resources inappropriately. Specific instructions. I leaned forward in my chair, suddenly understanding that Harold's planning had extended beyond protection into something that might be called retaliation. My gentle husband, who had never spoken an unkind word about anyone, had prepared consequences for those who would try to harm me after his death. He established a separate fund, Mr. Thornfield explained, opening another folder that contained documents I'd never seen before. Money specifically earmarked to defend your interests against family members who might try to exploit your grief or vulnerability. He called it your Independence Fund, and it's substantial enough to hire the best legal representation available. My Independence Fund. Harold had known that I would need to fight for my freedom, and he had given me the weapons to win that fight. But more than that, he had recognized that my children might become my enemies, and he had prepared me for a war I never wanted to fight. The implications were staggering and heartbreaking in equal measure. Harold had seen through David and Susan's performances to the calculation beneath, had recognized that their love was conditional on my usefulness and convenient on my compliance. His final gift wasn't just money. It was the recognition that I would need to defend myself against the people who should have been defending me. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. $500,000, Mr. Thornfield replied. Specifically allocated for legal fees, private investigators, security services, and any other resources you might need to protect yourself from family exploitation. $500,000 to defend myself against my own children. The number was obscene in its implications, a reflection of Harold's assessment of how dangerous they might become when their financial desperation collided with my newfound independence. But it was also a lifeline, a guarantee that I wouldn't face their attacks alone or defenseless. Over the following days, those attacks intensified with a creativity that might have been impressive if it weren't so cruel. David hired a private investigator to document my daily activities, looking for evidence of confusion or poor judgment that could support his competency challenge. I spotted the man easily enough, a middle-aged professional with cheap shoes and expensive camera equipment who thought he was being subtle while following me to the grocery store. Susan took a different approach, calling my new neighbors with expressions of concern about my mental state and suggestions that they report any unusual behavior to Adult Protective Services. Patricia told me about the call with the kind of indignation that only a retired librarian could muster, outraged that anyone would try to weaponize community concern against an elderly neighbor. "She made it sound like you were a danger to yourself," Patricia said over our morning coffee, her voice tight with anger. "Suggested that we should be watching for signs of confusion or poor judgment. I told her that the only poor judgment I observed was her own for trying to turn neighbors into spies." The campaign against my independence was coordinated and relentless, designed to create a paper trail of evidence that could support David's eventual court filing. Every phone call to a business was monitored for signs of confusion. Every social interaction was analyzed for inappropriate behavior. Every financial transaction was scrutinized for evidence of exploitation or poor decision-making. But Harold's preparations held firm against their assault. The trusts were structured to be challenge-proof, the legal protections were comprehensive and professionally crafted, and the evidence of my competency was overwhelming to anyone willing to examine it objectively. Dr. Martinez's medical assessment, combined with the testimony of neighbors and the professional opinions of people like Mr. Thornfield, created a defensive wall that David's desperate attacks couldn't breach. The breaking point came 6 weeks after I'd revealed Harold's legacy, when David finally filed formal papers seeking guardianship and conservatorship over my person and estate. The legal documents painted a picture of an elderly woman in decline, vulnerable to exploitation and incapable of managing significant financial resources without professional supervision. The picture they painted bore no resemblance to the woman I'd become since leaving their house. Independent, engaged, socially active, financially responsible, medically stable, and emotionally thriving. But legal documents have their own reality, and David's training allowed him to craft a narrative that sounded plausible to people who didn't know me personally. "This is war," Mr. Thornfield said when we met to discuss David's filing. "Your son is essentially arguing that you're incompetent to manage your own life, and he's asking the court to give him control over your person and your property. If he wins, he could institutionalize you against your will and gain access to everything Harold tried to protect." War. The word felt strange when applied to my relationship with my own son, but it captured the reality of what was happening better than any euphemism about family concern or protective intervention. David wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to control me. And if he succeeded, everything I'd gained since discovering Harold's legacy would be lost. But Mr. Thornfield's expression carried confidence as well as concern, the look of a professional who had fought similar battles before and won them. "Harold's documentation is exceptional," he said, "and your current circumstances provide overwhelming evidence of competency. This case should be straightforward to defend." Should be. The qualification worried me more than outright pessimism would have, the suggestion that even strong cases could be unpredictable when family members were involved. Courts were naturally sympathetic to children who claimed to be protecting elderly parents, even when those claims were motivated by greed rather than love. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving us time to prepare our defense, and David time to marshal whatever evidence he thought would support his claims. Those 3 weeks felt like a suspended sentence, every day shadowed by the possibility that a judge might decide I was incapable of managing my own life. During that time, I discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I organized my financial records, prepared detailed accounts of my daily activities, and gathered testimony from neighbors and service providers who could speak to my competency and independence. Patricia became my champion, rallying the other residents of Willowbrook Gardens to support my fight against what she characterized as an outrageous assault on personal freedom. "We've all raised children," she said during one of our strategy sessions, "and we all know the difference between love and greed. What your son is doing isn't protection, it's theft disguised as concern. Theft disguised as concern. The phrase captured something essential about David's legal strategy, the way he had weaponized the language of family care to justify what was essentially a financial predation. But recognizing his tactics didn't make them less dangerous, especially when those tactics were being deployed by someone with legal training and nothing left to lose. The night before the hearing, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the evidence of my independence and competency, preparing for a battle I had never wanted to fight. Financial statements showing responsible management of Harold's legacy, medical records demonstrating excellent health and cognitive function, testimony from neighbors about my social engagement and community involvement, personal accounts of daily activities that proved my ability to live independently. But underneath all the documentation and preparation lay a deeper truth that no amount of evidence could address. This hearing wasn't really about my competency or my need for protection. It was about whether love could be conditional, whether family bonds could be severed by financial desperation, whether the people who were supposed to care for me could transform into the people I needed protection from. Tomorrow I would face my son in a courtroom, represented by lawyers and surrounded by strangers who would decide whether I was capable of controlling my own destiny. The woman who had accepted their charity for 2 years, who had allowed herself to be treated as a burden and a problem, would stand before a judge and fight for the right to remain free. Harold's legacy had given me the resources for this fight, but the strength would have to come from somewhere deeper. From the woman I had been before grief and loneliness made me accept less than I deserved. From the mother who had raised children with love and sacrifice, only to discover that love could be returned with calculation and sacrifice could be repaid with abandonment. I thought about the moment when David first raised his voice to me, when Susan first spoke about me as if I weren't in the room, when my grandchildren first learned to look through me as if I were invisible. All the small cruelties that had accumulated into a massive betrayal. All the casual indignities that had eroded my sense of worth until I believed their version of who I was supposed to be. But Harold's planning had reminded me of who I really was, who I had always been beneath the grief and acceptance. Meredith Caldwell, strong enough to work 3 jobs to put David through law school, smart enough to manage our household finances, while Harold built his business. Capable enough to care for him through his final illness with grace and devotion. That woman, the one I had been before they convinced me I was helpless, would walk into that courtroom tomorrow and fight for her. Freedom. Not just the financial freedom that Harold's legacy provided, but the deeper freedom to be valued and respected, and allowed to make her own choices about her own life. The stakes couldn't be higher. If David won, I would lose everything Harold had tried to protect. My independence, my autonomy, my right to determine my own future. I would become a ward of the court, subject to David's decisions about where I should live and how my money should be spent. The rest of my life would be determined by someone who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. But if I won, if Harold's protections held and my evidence proved compelling, then I would be truly free for the first time since his death. Free to live according to my own choices, to spend my remaining years as I saw fit, to show my children that their mother was stronger and more resourceful than they had ever imagined. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tonight, I would prepare for the most important battle of my life, armed with Harold's love and my own rediscovered strength, ready to prove that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how old you are, or how much it costs. The woman who walked into David and Susan's house 2 years ago, broken by grief and willing to accept whatever scraps of belonging they offered, was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood her own worth, someone who refused to be discarded or controlled, someone who would fight for her freedom with every resource at her disposal. I am Meredith Caldwell, and tomorrow I reclaim my life. The courtroom feels smaller than I expected, more intimate and therefore more dangerous. Judge Patricia Morrison presides from her bench with the weary authority of someone who has seen too many families tear themselves apart over money and pride. Her gray hair is pulled back severely, her expression neutral but alert as she reviews the files spread before her. This woman will decide whether I remain free or become a prisoner of my son's desperation. David sits at the plaintiff's table. With his attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Rebecca Walsh who specializes in elder law from the perspective of concerned family members. She's younger than Susan, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from winning cases others might consider morally questionable. Her opening statement paints me as a vulnerable widow being exploited by unscrupulous advisors who are helping me squander my late husband's legacy. Your Honor, she begins, her voice carrying practiced sympathy. Mrs. Caldwell is clearly suffering from the kind of cognitive decline that makes elderly people susceptible to financial manipulation. Her recent decisions show a pattern of poor judgment that puts her substantial inheritance at risk. Poor judgment. Moving out of my son's house where I was treated like an unwanted burden. Hiring competent legal counsel to protect my interests. Choosing to live independently in a community where I'm valued and respected. According to Ms. Walsh, these decisions prove my incompetency rather than my strength. Mr. Thornfield rises for our response, his presence commanding the kind of respect that comes from decades of successful practice. Unlike Ms. Walsh's theatrical sympathy, his approach is methodical and factual, building our case with evidence rather than emotion. Your Honor, he says, Mrs. Caldwell is not a victim of exploitation. She is a competent adult who discovered resources her late husband had carefully protected for exactly this situation. Her current living arrangement and financial management demonstrate excellent judgment, not cognitive decline. The battle lines are drawn with surgical precision. David's team will argue that my age and grief have made me vulnerable to manipulation, that my decision to live independently proves I'm incapable of making sound choices. Our team will demonstrate that I'm thriving in my new circumstances, that Harold's legacy has allowed me to reclaim my autonomy rather than lose it. David takes the stand first, his testimony a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as concern. He describes a mother who has become increasingly isolated and suspicious since her husband's death, someone who rejects family help and makes impulsive decisions about significant sums of money. His voice breaks at carefully calculated moments, painting himself as the devoted son desperately trying to protect his mother from her own poor judgment. She's not the woman who raised me, he says, dabbing at his eyes with a tissue that Ms. Walsh provides with theatrical timing. The mother I knew was careful with money, valued family above everything, and would never have made such drastic changes without consulting the people who love her. The people who love her. I want to laugh at the audacity of that phrase, coming from someone who spent months planning my exile to institutional care. But David's performance is convincing, his legal training evident in the way he frames his greed as devotion and his control as protection. Susan follows with her own testimony, describing my supposedly erratic behavior and questionable decision-making. She tells the court about my refusal to accept their care, my sudden secretiveness about financial matters, and my willingness to trust strangers over family members who have my best interests at heart. She's become paranoid, Susan says, her teacher's authority lending credibility to her words. She thinks we're trying to control her when all we want is to make sure she's safe and properly cared for. The mother I know would never have left her family to live among strangers. The mother she knows, the compliant elderly woman who accepted charity and abuse with equal gratitude, who allowed herself to be treated as invisible rather than fighting for respect. That mother is indeed gone, replaced by someone who refuses to be discarded or controlled. Their private investigator testifies about my daily routine, describing activities he claims show confusion and poor judgment. My friendship with Patricia becomes evidence of inappropriate social dependency. My grocery shopping proves I'm incapable of managing complex financial decisions. Every aspect of my independent life is twisted into proof of incompetency by someone who never spoke to me directly, but claims to understand my mental state. The medical testimony they present comes from a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Brennan, who has never examined me but offers expert opinions based on David and Susan's descriptions of my behavior. He talks about the correlation between grief and cognitive decline, the vulnerability of elderly widows to financial exploitation, and the warning signs of diminished capacity that my family has allegedly observed. Based on the family's testimony, Dr. Brennan concludes, Mrs. Caldwell appears to be exhibiting classic symptoms of mild cognitive impairment exacerbated by grief and social isolation. The sudden lifestyle changes and rejection of family support are consistent with the kind of poor judgment we see in early-stage dementia. Early-stage dementia. The words hang in the courtroom like an accusation, a medical diagnosis crafted from second-hand testimony and financial motivation. This man has never spoken to me, never observed my behavior, never reviewed my actual medical records, but he's willing to declare me incompetent based on my children's desire to control my inheritance. Then it's our turn, and Mr. Thornfield begins systematically dismantling their case with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Dr. Martinez takes the stand first, her testimony a stark contrast to Dr. Brennan's speculation. She has examined me regularly for 15 years, including twice since I discovered Harold's legacy, and her assessment is unequivocal. Mrs. Caldwell shows no signs of cognitive decline, she states firmly. Her recent decisions reflect improved emotional well-being and excellent judgment about her living situation. The independence she's achieved has actually enhanced her physical and mental health significantly. Patricia follows with testimony that brings warmth to the sterile courtroom atmosphere. She describes our friendship, my active participation in community activities, and my obvious competency in managing daily life. Her indignation at David and Susan's characterization of me is palpable and convincing. Meredith is one of the sharpest, most capable women I've ever known, Patricia declares. The idea that she needs protection from her own decisions is absurd. If anything, she needs protection from family members who seem more interested in her money than her well-being. Mr. Thornfield presents Harold's documentation with the reverence due to a master craftsman's final work. The trusts, the legal protections, the careful planning that anticipated exactly this situation. Judge Morrison examines each document with the attention they deserve, clearly impressed by the thoroughness and foresight Harold demonstrated in protecting my interests. These arrangements, Mr. Thornfield explains, were created by a man who understood that financial resources can make elderly people targets for exploitation, even by family members. Mr. Caldwell specifically designed these protections to ensure his wife's independence and autonomy, regardless of pressure from others. When I finally take the stand, the courtroom feels charged with anticipation. This is the moment everything has been building toward, when the woman at the center of this battle speaks for herself. I've prepared for this testimony as carefully as I prepared for the most important presentations of my working life, but no amount of preparation can eliminate the stakes involved. Ms. Walsh's cross-examination is aggressive and personal, designed to rattle me into making statements that could support their case. She questions my understanding of Harold's financial arrangements, suggests I'm being manipulated by Mr. Thornfield, and implies that my estrangement from my children proves I'm incapable of maintaining healthy relationships. Mrs. Caldwell, she says, her voice dripping with false concern, don't you think it's unusual for a loving mother to abandon her family in favor of strangers? Doesn't this suggest some kind of cognitive or emotional impairment? I look directly at her, then at David and Susan sitting at the plaintiff's table, before turning to address Judge Morrison directly. Your Honor, I didn't abandon my family. I left a situation where I was treated as a burden and a problem rather than a person deserving of respect. The strangers I'm supposedly favoring treat me with more kindness and consideration than my own. Children showed me during the 2 years I lived in their home The silence that follows is profound. Ms. Walsh tries to continue her attack, but I've found my voice now, the strength that Harold's legacy was meant to provide. I describe the daily humiliations, the casual cruelties, the systematic erosion of my dignity that led to their plan to exile me to institutional care. My testimony is calm and factual, but its emotional impact is devastating. I discovered Harold's legacy 3 weeks after my son lost his job, I continue, and suddenly their urgent concern for my welfare became apparent. They weren't worried about my ability to live independently. They were worried about losing access to money they thought belonged to them. David's face flushes red as I speak, his composure finally cracking under the weight of truth spoken in open court. Susan stares at her hands, unable to meet my eyes as I describe their treatment of me with clinical precision. The devoted children. They've portrayed themselves as are revealed as calculating strangers who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity. Judge Morrison asks me directly about my current living situation, my daily routines, my plans for the future. I describe my apartment at Willowbrook Gardens, my friendship with Patricia, my financial management under Mr. Thornfield's guidance. The picture that emerges is of a competent woman thriving in circumstances she chose for herself. Do you understand the value of your late husband's legacy? Judge Morrison asks. I understand that Harold worked his entire life to provide for my security and independence, I reply. He knew that money could make me a target, so he protected it in ways that would ensure my freedom rather than my vulnerability. My children want to control that legacy, but Harold's planning prevents anyone from exploiting me, including family members who might not have my best interests at heart. The testimony phase concludes with Mr. Thornfield's presentation of character, witnesses from Willowbrook Gardens, local businesses where I shop, and service providers who work with me regularly. Each person describes interactions with a woman who is clearly competent, engaged, and capable of making independent decisions. The cumulative effect is overwhelming evidence of my mental and emotional stability. Judge Morrison calls for a brief recess before closing arguments, and I sit with Mr. Thornfield reviewing our position while David and his team huddle around their table in what appears to be increasingly desperate consultation. Ms. Walsh's expression suggests she knows her case is failing, but desperation can make attorneys dangerous in ways that confidence never does. The closing arguments crystallize the fundamental question before the court. Ms. Walsh makes one final appeal to family values and filial concern, arguing that children have both the right and the responsibility to protect elderly parents from poor decisions, regardless of those parents' protests. Mrs. Caldwell may seem competent today, she argues, but the pattern of behavior her family has observed suggests progressive decline that will only worsen without proper supervision. The court has an opportunity to provide protection before a crisis occurs rather than waiting until it's too late. Mr. Thornfield's response is devastating in its simplicity. Your Honor, this case isn't about Mrs. Caldwell's competency. It's about her son's unemployment and his family's financial desperation. They want control over resources that don't belong to them, and they're willing to declare their mother incompetent to get it. He pauses, letting that truth settle in. The courtroom before continuing. Harold Caldwell spent years protecting his wife's future independence. He understood that money could make her vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation we see here today. Mrs. Caldwell doesn't need protection from her own decisions. She needs protection from family members who see her inheritance as the solution to their problems. Judge Morrison retires to consider her decision, leaving us to wait in the courthouse lobby while she weighs evidence and testimony that will determine my future. The wait feels eternal, each minute stretching like an hour while I contemplate the possibility that everything Harold tried to protect could be stripped away by a legal system designed to help families exploit elderly relatives. When we're called back into the courtroom, Judge Morrison's expression reveals nothing about her decision. She reviews the evidence methodically, addressing each aspect of David's case and our response with judicial precision. The suspense is almost unbearable as she works through the legal standards for guardianship and the evidence required to override an adult's right to self-determination. This court has reviewed extensive testimony about Mrs. Caldwell's mental state, living situation, and decision-making capacity. Judge Morrison begins. While the plaintiff has expressed legitimate concerns about his mother's welfare, the evidence does not support a finding of incompetency or need for guardianship. The words hit David like physical blows, his face cycling through shock, anger, and desperate calculation as Judge Morrison continues her ruling. Mrs. Caldwell has demonstrated excellent judgment in her current living arrangements and financial management. Her medical evaluations show no cognitive decline, and her testimony reveals a competent adult making informed decisions about her own life. The fact that these decisions differ from her family's preferences does not constitute grounds for guardianship. Judge Morrison's final words echo through the courtroom with the authority of law and justice. The petition for guardianship is denied. Mrs. Caldwell retains full control over her person and property. The gavel falls with finality, ending David's attempt to control my life and affirming my right to live according to my own choices. Mr. Thornfield shakes my hand with professional satisfaction, but his smile carries genuine warmth for a victory that means more than money or legal precedent. David and Susan leave the courtroom without speaking to me, their faces reflecting the bitter realization that their plan has failed completely. Ms. Walsh gathers her files with the efficient disappointment of someone accustomed to losing cases that shouldn't have been filed in the first place. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my apartment watching the sunrise through windows that face east toward hope and possibility. Patricia and I are planning a trip to Europe, something I've always wanted to do but never had the freedom to pursue. Harold's legacy has given me not just financial security, but the power to live according to my own dreams, rather than other people's expectations. David found another job eventually, though it pays significantly less than his previous position, and requires him to rebuild a reputation damaged by his firing. Susan continues teaching, their family adjusting to reduced circumstances without the inheritance they counted on to solve their problems. We haven't spoken since the court hearing, their silence a final confirmation that their love was always conditional on my compliance. My grandchildren send birthday cards now, stilted notes that suggest they've been told to maintain contact without understanding why their grandmother is no longer part of their daily lives. Perhaps someday they'll be old enough to understand what really happened, to recognize that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the people you need protection from. Harold's planning proved prophetic in ways that break my heart and heal it simultaneously. He saw what I couldn't see, understood what I wasn't ready to accept, and prepared for a future that I hoped would never come. His final gift wasn't just money. It was the recognition that I was strong enough to fight for myself when fighting became necessary. I think about the woman who walked into David and Susan's house 2 years ago, broken by grief and willing to accept whatever scraps of belonging they offered. That woman believed that family love was unconditional, that sacrifice would be remembered and returned, that growing old meant accepting whatever arrangements others made for your convenience. She was wrong about many things, but she was right about one thing that matters more than all the rest. She was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth treating with dignity and respect. Harold knew that truth when he created my financial fortress. I learned it when I found the strength to defend myself against people who should have been defending me. I am Meredith Caldwell, 78 years old and finally free to live according to my own choices. The inheritance my children tried to control has given me something more valuable than money. It has given me back myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.